Post-World War II Injustices, the silence the world tried to forget, my personal account. I grew up hearing that World War II ended justly, that the guilty were punished, that the horrors were in the past, and that humanity had finally learned its lesson. But that was just what they said in books. What no one ever told me, and what I only discovered many years later, is that the end of the war didn't mean the end of suffering. In fact, for many people, it was just the beginning of a new pain. A quieter pain. A pain without headlines, without memorials, without a voice. I thought I knew the story, until a forgotten detail led me down a dark path, full of hushed secrets and names erased from official records. What you're about to hear isn't a documentary, nor a theory, it's a story. My story. And perhaps, when you finish this video, you'll also begin to wonder, do we really know the victors? Or do we just choose to believe what's easiest to accept? It all started on a rainy Sunday afternoon. I was alone, rummaging through some old boxes in my mother's basement. Boxes dusty, filled with photo albums, old medals, some faded military uniforms. And then, at the bottom of one of them, I found a yellowed leather folder, its clasp nearly falling apart from age. I opened it. Inside were old, typewritten papers, some scribbled by hand. At the top of the pile, a letter. It was addressed to someone named Franz, my grandfather's name. But that wasn't the strangest part. It was the sender, Allied Administration, 1946. And below it, just a single sentence written in German that I had to translate later, what we did was not justice. But it was necessary. That gave me chills. Because, until that moment, what I knew about the end of the war was what everyone else knew, that the Allies were the heroes, and the others were the villains. But that letter had a guilty tone. A weight. As if someone were trying to ease their conscience. Too late. I began to pull at the thread. The first thing I did was call my mother, ask if she knew any untold stories about Grandpa Franz. She hesitated, swallowed hard, and said to me, in a voice almost whispered, "Your grandfather wasn't the man you think." I was silent for a few seconds. And then she hung up. She didn't want to say anything else. That night, I didn't sleep. I kept reading and rereading that letter, trying to understand. Why would someone write that? What was necessary? And why did that word seem more like an excuse than an explanation? In the following days, I dove in head first. I combed through public archives, researched genealogy forums, exchanged emails with historians. And the more I read, the more I felt there was a hole in the story we'd been told. Not about the conflict itself, but about what came after. About the lingering rage, the thirst for revenge, the deals made in the dark, the rushed trials, and the lives destroyed away from the cameras. I began to understand that the war didn't actually end with the surrender. It only changed form. And it was at that moment that something inside me broke. Because until then, I thought my grandfather had been just another soldier among millions. But what if he had participated in something he himself considered unforgivable? The thought gnawed at me. Guilt seemed to have seeped into the letter, into my grandfather's eyes in the old photos, into the way he always avoided questions about that time. And then, when I discovered that he had served not at the front, but in administrative areas in the months following the end of the conflict, more precisely, in zones occupied by France and the US, my stomach turned. Because it was precisely in these places that some of the darkest episodes of the post-war period took place. Secret prisons, disappearances, mass expulsions, torture, repression, all in the name of peace. But peace built on injustice is never complete. And perhaps my grandfather knew this. Perhaps that's why he never spoke. Perhaps that's why, when I was a child and asked him if he was proud of having fought, he just lowered his head and changed the subject. It wasn't pride. It was shame. Or fear. Or both. And now that I had that fragment of the past in my hands, that cursed letter, I couldn't do it anymore. Pretending I didn't know. I could no longer live within the sanitized, heroic version of history. I needed to dig deeper. I needed to understand what really happened. Because, somehow, that hidden story was connected to me. To my family. To the silence that hovered like a ghost at every gathering, every birthday, every toast made with a forced smile. That's when my search truly began. And what I discovered in the following weeks changed everything. Because there's a forgotten war between the final pages of history books. A war made of silence, of unburied bodies, of scars that no one dares to show it. And perhaps, if you have the courage to follow me to the end, this story will also change the way you see what it means to win a war. My grandfather was always a man of few words. One of those gentlemen who seemed to carry the weight of the world on his shoulders, even when he said nothing. He liked to spend hours sitting on the porch, an unlit cigarette between his lips, gazing at the horizon as if he saw something we couldn't. When I was a child, I thought he was just remembering the past. But today, after everything I've discovered, I'm almost certain he was trying to forget it. There was a kind of silence that enveloped my grandfather whenever the subject of the war was discussed. All it took was for someone to mention that period, even if it was a movie, a joke, a stray memory, for his expression to change. His gaze became distant, his face serious, and he closed in on himself as if an invisible wall had been erected around him. I remember one Christmas when a cousin brought a book called Heroes of World War II and started talking about how Allied soldiers had saved the world. My grandfather got up from the table without saying a single word and locked himself in his room for the rest of the night. At the time, we thought he was just old and tired. But now I know it was more than that. It was pain. Guilt. A past he couldn't digest. He never told me what he saw. He never explained to me what he had experienced. But he left clues. Fragments. Looks. And a silence so heavy that, over time, I began to understand that he wasn't just a survivor of the war, he was also a victim of what came after. Or maybe, even worse, an accomplice. Something about him told me he had been part of something bigger. Something dirty. Something that ate away at him from the inside. And maybe that was why he never really smiled. Maybe that was why he avoided photos. That he had no old friends. He spent hours locked in his room, listening to classical music on the radio as if trying to protect himself from the real world. I remember one day in particular. I must have been about 13. I was studying for a history test and I asked him if it was true that the Allied soldiers had freed all the prisoners and ended the camps. He looked at me with a look that I have never forgotten. Not anger, not pain. It was an empty look. As if his soul had been disconnected for a moment. And then he said, in a low voice, almost swallowed by the silence of the room, "Some were freed. Others, not so much." And he looked back out the window. At the time, I didn't understand. But today those words echo in my head like a dark whisper. Others, not so much. It was only after I found that letter in the basement that everything began to fit together. The absences. The lapses. The nightmares he had at night that my grandmother said were coming of age. The murmurs in German during his sleep. That look of someone who had seen too much but was forbidden to tell. As if he had made a pact with oblivion. Or with guilt. And every time I tried to find out more, it seemed like he was moving further away. Until one day, I asked him directly, "Did you kill anyone in the war, Grandpa?" And he looked at me with tears in his eyes. For the first time, he cried in front of me. But he didn't answer. He just shook his head, as if to say it doesn't matter or it's none of your business. And at that moment, I felt like there was a prison inside him that he had never left. His silence became an enigma in my life. Something that I carried with me for years. Something that haunted me. Every time I watched a documentary, a war film, or even a news story about conflicts, I remembered him. His silent face. His trembling fingers. His heavy breathing in the early hours of the morning. I remember that for years I thought he was just another traumatized soldier. But now I know there was more. Much more. And this more was linked to what no one wanted to tell. To the injustices that happened after the end. To the civilians massacred in silence. To the revenge disguised as justice. To the camps that continue to exist, only with new guards, new flags, and the same kind of suffering. He died without telling his story. He took with him secrets that may never fully come to light. But even so, he left me with signs. And with each clue I find, with each document, with each testimony I hear, it is as if he was still with me, saying, without words, search. You will understand. And I understood. I understood that his story was not just his. It was that of thousands. Of soldiers who returned home in silence. Of women who never trusted anyone again. Of children who grew up afraid of the dark. Of ghosts who walk among the forgotten pages of history. My grandfather was one of them. And, somehow, I became one too. That's why, even after his death, I keep digging. Not for revenge. Not for glory. But for justice. For truth. For the memory of those who never had the chance to speak. Because silence, however heavy, always carries a story within it. And my grandfather's, the one he never had the strength to tell, is now in my hands. And perhaps, as I continue speaking, he will finally find some peace. For most of my life, I believed in that comfortable image that when World War II ended, the world breathed a sigh of relief. That the guilty were tried, the innocent freed, and humanity had finally learned from its own horror. But it didn't take long for me to realize that this was merely a convenient version of history. A narrative molded to fit textbooks and political speeches. What I found when I began digging, when I delved deep into the archives, the buried accounts, and the silenced memories, was something much darker. Something no one wants to admit. The post-war period did not bring peace for everyone. For some, it only brought a new kind of suffering, all the more cruel because it came under the guise of justice. One thing struck me deeply early on in my research: how quickly the spotlight dimmed. When the bombs stopped falling, newspapers turned their headlines to reconstruction. But no one spoke of the human wreckage that remained in the forgotten corners of Europe. Millions of people, men, women, children, became invisible almost overnight. And worse, they were treated as disposable. As if, because they were ethnic Germans, or suspected of collaboration, or simply on the wrong side of the border, they deserved no compassion. Or justice. And that's when I began to wonder, was the end of the war truly the end, or just a change of enemies? I discovered that between 1945 and 1950, millions of civilians were displaced, expelled, persecuted, and even exterminated. And not by Nazis. Not by fascists. But by Allied forces and Eastern European governments, now liberated and eager for retaliation. A new violence, masquerading as historical revenge, began to spread. Ethnic Germans were torn from their homes in countries like Poland, Czechoslovakia, Hungary, and Yugoslavia. And it didn't matter if they were elderly, children, or even if they had never supported the Nazi regime. What mattered was their surname. The language spoken at home. Their origins. They became enemies by definition. Guilty by association. And no one, absolutely no one, spoke up to defend them. I clearly remember the first testimony I read. It was from a woman named Elizabeth, who was only 9 years old at the time. She lived with her family in a small village in the Sudetenland. Her father was a baker. He had never been involved in politics. But that didn't matter. In May 1945, Czech soldiers invaded the village, declared that all Germans would be expelled, and gave them just a few hours to gather their belongings. Anyone who resisted would be killed. Elizabeth recounted seeing her own grandmother beaten to death for refusing to leave the house where she was born. Her mother was raped in front of everyone, and her older brother, just 15, was taken by soldiers and never returned. All this, days after Germany's official surrender. These accounts were not exceptions. They were the norm. And it wasn't just the civilian population that suffered. Prison camps were maintained under Allied command. Many of them, like those in the French and Soviet zones, were veritable hells. Overcrowded. No food. No medical care. Prisoners, now called dangerous elements or repatriates, died daily. And this was no secret. But it also didn't make headlines. It was simply ignored. Because, after all, they were the defeated. And the pain of the defeated, apparently, didn't deserve space in the narrative of victory. The more I read, the sicker I felt. Because the justice promised to the world after the conflict increasingly seemed like a smokescreen. Selective trials. Impunity for allies who committed crimes. Mass expulsions legitimized by political agreements. And all of this with the seal of reconstruction. As if building a new world justified destroying what remained of another. And the cruelest thing is that many of these acts were justified with the same rhetoric used by totalitarian regimes: necessary, inevitable, for the greater good. I began to understand that war creates monsters. But what comes after it does too. Only these monsters are harder to identify. They don't wear uniforms. They don't march in parades. They wear suits, pens, protocols. They sign expulsion decrees. They reorganize borders. They decide who lives and who disappears. And they do it under the guise of reconstruction. This frightened me more than any bomb. And it was at that point that everything became personal. Because I began to suspect that my grandfather, that silent man he always looked at the ground when we talked about the war, perhaps he'd seen it firsthand. Or worse, perhaps he'd been a part of it. He'd been in the French occupation zone in 1946. He was the administrator of a triage camp. And I discovered, through documents hidden in military archives, that in that same camp, dozens of civilians had died from neglect, starvation, disease, beatings. My grandfather signed reports. I saw his signature on one of them. And I wondered, did he know? Did he try to stop it? Or did he simply obey? These questions began to haunt me. And perhaps, deep down, that's why I'm here telling this story. Because when the war ends, the shooting stops, but the wounds remain open. And the silence that follows can be even more brutal. Today, I know that the world chose to forget. That many pretended nothing happened. But the faces of those who suffered are still out there, in forgotten archives, in unanswered letters, in memories no one wanted to hear. And perhaps it's my mission now to give voice to that silence. Even if it hurts. Even if it's too late. Because true peace can only exist when the truth comes out, and the world finally sees what it chose not to see. I've always been told that the Nuremberg trials represented the pinnacle of international justice. That for the first time in history, leaders of a brutal regime were brought before a world tribunal to pay for their crimes. And for a long time, I believed it. But as I delved deeper into this forgotten part of the post-war period, a nagging doubt began to grow within me. Something didn't add up. The talk of impartial justice didn't match the accounts I was encountering. With the forgotten faces of the victims who were denied a trial. With the guilty who escaped. With the innocent who paid for the sins of others. And that's when the question hit me hard, like a punch in the gut. Were the Nuremberg trials truly justice, or just the justice of the victors? This question stuck in my head. At first, it seemed absurd. A provocation. But with each new document I read, with each hidden testimony that emerged before my eyes, it made more sense. Because while the great names of Nazism were being hanged, with all the media coverage that this generated, there were other men, equally cruel, who got away with it. Men who had valuable information for the Allies. Scientists. Strategists. Informants. Many of them were simply transferred in secret to the United States or the Soviet Union. Others had their records cleared for lack of evidence. And the few who were convicted in secondary trials ended up being released years later, when the Cold War made it more convenient to pardon them than to keep them imprisoned. I discovered, for example, the case of an SS officer named Karl. He had run a prison in Eastern Europe during the final years of the war. He was known for his brutality. There are records of at least 200 executions under his command. And yet he was acquitted after cooperating with American authorities. He went to live in Bavaria as if nothing had happened. He died in 1982. Of natural causes. Surrounded by his family. No punishment. No public shame. Meanwhile, that same year, a woman named Greta, a German civilian, the widow of a railway worker, still lived with scars on her arms, burn marks inflicted by Soviet soldiers in 1945 when they invaded her village. She never got justice. She never got compensation. She never got a hearing. These stories made me tremble. Not only because of the cruelty they contained, but because of the brutal contrast between those who had a voice and those who were silenced. The scales of justice were not balanced. They were rigged. They were tilted on the side of the victors. And the more I listened to the stories of those who survived the post-war period, the more I understood that many of those who were punished were not the real monsters, and many of the monsters walked free, protected by the cloak of political expediency. It was in this context that I rediscovered a name that had haunted me since the beginning of my search, Otto Brenner. For years, he was just a name whispered at family dinners. A distant friend of my grandfather. But as I dug deeper into my investigation, I discovered that Otto had worked at the same triage camp my grandfather ran in 1946. More than that, Otto had interrogated German prisoners trying to prove they were just civilians trying to survive. I found his name in a report. It said, "Methods of psychological pressure employed. Effective." It made me sick. Otto was called to testify in a French court years later, accused of physical and psychological abuse against prisoners. But his testimony was dismissed. He claimed he was merely following orders from the Allied command. And that was enough. An argument that, ironically, didn't hold water with the Nazi officers at Nuremberg. There, following orders wasn't a justification. Here, apparently, it was. It destroyed me inside. Because I realized there were two kinds of justice being meted out, one for the vanquished, another for the Allies. And this realization put my grandfather's past in a new, even darker light. What if my grandfather had also followed orders? What if he had turned a blind eye to abuses, believing it was part of the price of reconstruction? Or worse, what if he himself had decided who was guilty and who should disappear into the shadows of the reports? The idea gnawed at me. But there was more. In a letter never sent, written by him, which I found among the saved documents, my grandfather said something that made me tremble. We were taught to believe that evil had only one face. Today, I realize that it changes faces depending on which side of the wall we're on. That sentence kept hammering in my head for days. It said it all. That perhaps he knew. That perhaps he had understood, too late, that it wasn't all about right or wrong, but about power. And that those who accused also committed crimes. That those who judged also concealed them. And that the victims, often, weren't in the dock, but among the anonymous, the displaced, those buried without a name. The world applauded Nuremberg. And perhaps rightly so. It needed to happen. But what no one wanted to see was what happened afterward. The secret trials. The extrajudicial executions. The revamped camps. The guilty spared in the name of science or politics. The innocent condemned by nationality. That wasn't justice. It was a new order, masquerading as redemption. And today, when I reflect on all this, I realize that the history we learned in school is just one layer. A narrative crafted to make us sleep peacefully. But if we have the courage to scratch that surface, we'll see that the end of the war wasn't the beginning of peace. It was the beginning of a new darkness. A quieter one. More diplomatic. But still, profoundly cruel. And perhaps it's time to tell this part of the story. Even if it hurts. Even if it bothers. Because only then can we honor those who have been forgotten, and prevent the same cycle of injustice from repeating itself, with a new name and a new uniform. The first time I read the phrase post-war ethnic cleansing, I stopped. Stuck, actually. I refused to believe it. That phrase seemed wrong, seemed out of place, like an unfounded accusation. After all, ethnic cleansing was a term I'd always associated with Nazi horror, concentration camps, racial ideology. But once I started reading the hidden reports, the abandoned letters, the hushed testimonies, I saw. The truth hit me like a wave of mud. Heavy, dark, irrefutable. What happened between 1945 and 1950 was exactly that. A cleansing. Only now the targets didn't wear swastikas. They were ordinary civilians. Ethnic Germans who paid the price for crimes they didn't commit, simply because they spoke the wrong language, were born in the wrong place, and lost the war. My grandfather never mentioned this. But he lived precisely at that time. In the heart of this chaos. In the French occupation zone, near the Austrian border. For a long time, I thought he was there merely performing bureaucratic duties. But the more I investigated, the more I understood that he was part of a silent cycle of collective punishment. A cycle that began with the Potsdam Agreements, signed by the great powers, which legalized, yes, legalized, the mass transfer of German populations from Poland, Czechoslovakia, Hungary, and Romania. In theory, these were organized relocations. In practice, they were brutal, inhumane, and often lethal expulsions. The images I found in the archives are difficult to describe. Entire families being dragged from their homes at gunpoint. Women with children in their arms trying to cross frozen borders. Elderly people lying on the floor of train stations, dying of cold or hunger. In one photo, a man kneels, holding a small suitcase in both hands. The caption says he was executed minutes later for refusing to leave his hometown, where he had lived for 67 years. This kind of pain, it doesn't fit into pages. It doesn't fit into reports. It can only be understood when you look into these people's eyes. When you read their unsent letters. When you hear their voices, broken by loss. One of those voices belonged to a woman named Christina. I met her by chance, through a forum for descendants of East Germans. She was over 80 years old and lived alone in a small village in Austria. Her story was like so many others, until you heard the details. In 1945, at the age of 11, Christina saw her home invaded by Yugoslav soldiers. Her father was tied to a tree and beaten to death. Her mother was taken by 3 men. She never returned. Christina was placed in a cart with other children and pushed toward the Austrian border. Along the way, she saw children die of thirst. One of them was her younger sister. She was buried in a makeshift grave, her hands still clutching the doll she held in her lap. When she finished telling the story, there was a silence between us. Thick. Uncomfortable. And then, her voice trembling, she asked, "Do you think my story will ever matter?" I didn't know how to respond. Because the truth is, stories like hers were swept under the rug of official history. As if these victims didn't deserve justice. As if their suffering were a natural consequence of war. As if they had to silently accept what came after surrender. And that's when I realized something terrible. The world tolerates suffering, as long as it affects the defeated. As long as it comes as a response. As punishment. But there's a fine line between justice and revenge. And when that line is crossed, as it was in this case, what remains is an echo of horror that has no side. That has no flag. That only destroys. Reading about it in academic books is one thing. Seeing the documents, the names, the ages, the penciled notes saying rejected or transferred to Campex is quite another. I found lists with over 800 names of civilians expelled from a single village in less than 24 hours. Among them, 137 were children. The youngest was 2 years old. The oldest, 92. And they all disappeared. No records. No graves. No voices. These people were erased. And perhaps the only way to prevent them from disappearing completely is to tell their stories. At this point in my search, I began to feel that my grandfather knew. That he saw this up close. And that, for some reason, he chose silence. Maybe out of fear. Maybe out of shame. Maybe because he tried to prevent it and failed. Or because he participated without understanding the gravity of what he was doing. I'll never know for sure. But something inside him broke back then. And now I understand why. Because when you witness an injustice that the world pretends didn't happen, it scars you. It shapes you. And, in his case, it shaped him silently. This part of history, the post-war ethnic cleansing, is an open wound that the world refuses to look at. Some say that addressing this issue is relativizing Nazi crimes. But that's not the case. Not at all. Acknowledging these injustices doesn't diminish the brutality of what happened during the war. On the contrary, it reinforces the urgency of seeing human beings beyond labels. Because when we allow the pain of some to be treated as less legitimate than that of others, we create fertile ground for the next cycle of violence. Today, when I look at the archives, the photos, the stories like Christina's, I feel a weight on my shoulders. A weight that perhaps my grandfather carried until the end of his life. And, in a way, I'm the one carrying it now. Not out of guilt. But out of responsibility. Because as long as these voices are ignored, the war is not over. It lives on, hidden among the pages torn from our collective memory. And perhaps my mission, our mission, is precisely that, to put those pages back in place. Even if they force us to face the side of history we'd rather forget. It was on a winter afternoon, while walking through a forgotten village in the Polish countryside, that Marta's story found me. I was there searching for archives, documents, or any record of the internment camp where my grandfather had served in 1946. I had already passed through 3 public archives, 2 museums, and dozens of dusty shelves. But it wasn't in any of these places that I found what would change my perception of everything. It was in a nearly ruined house, with a crooked facade and windows covered in plastic, where a woman with hollow eyes greeted me with the distrust of someone who has seen the world betray too many promises. Her name was Jadwiga. She was over 90 years old. I learned of her existence from a local historian, who told me she had worked as a nurse in displaced person centers in the post-war period. When I mentioned the name of the camp I was looking for, she took a moment before responding. Then, without saying a word, she stood, grabbed a rusty key hanging behind a portrait, and led me to a small cellar beneath the house. The wooden stairs creaked beneath our feet, and the musty smell was so strong it stung our noses. Down there, in a dark corner, she pointed to a brick wall. She knocked twice with the palm of her hand. The sound was hollow. Then she whispered, "It's in here, but only if you promise to listen to everything." With great care, we removed the loose bricks. Behind it was a compartment, makeshift, rough, but still intact, and inside it, wrapped in cloth, was a thick, black-covered notebook, grimy with age. It was Marta's diary. A 17-year-old girl who had been imprisoned in that camp between 1945 and 1947. She was an ethnic German who lived with her parents in a village about 30 kilometers away before being captured and forcibly taken after the war. The diary was nearly 200 pages long, all handwritten in a firm, pained, yet incredibly clear handwriting. On the first page, just one sentence: "If I disappear, may these words not disappear with me." As I read, time seemed to stand still. Marta wrote not as a desperate victim, but as someone aware that she needed to leave a testimony. Her words were filled with pain, yes, but also with a disturbing lucidity. She recounted her days in the camp with brutal precision: the nighttime screams, the biting cold, the rotten food, the unjustified punishments. She spoke of other young women held with her in a poorly insulated barracks, guarded by soldiers who mocked them in languages they didn't understand. She wrote about the forced body inspections, the humiliations, the constant fear of being taken away at night and never returning. In one passage, she mentioned a man who commanded the prisoner screening. She didn't give his name, but described him in detail: tall, with grey eyes, a strange accent, not Polish, not Russian. She called him the man of silence because he rarely spoke. He just watched, wrote on a pad of paper, and nodded. The fate of the prisoners, she said, was decided in seconds by that gesture. Marta believed he wasn't cruel, which, in a way, made it all the worse. The cruel ones scream, beat. He just watches and condemns, as if his coldness were the ultimate form of violence. When I read this, my entire body froze. The description, the way he acted, his role in the camp, everything pointed to a possibility that haunts me to this day. What if the so-called man of silence was my grandfather? The diary continued. In the following pages, Marta recounted how, one night, she saw a group of women being taken to a basement. The screams lasted for hours. When day broke, none of them were there anymore. Some said they had been transferred. Others, that they had escaped. But Marta knew. She saw the bloodstains in the snow. She saw the soldiers leaving with dirty hands. She wrote down names, dates, even rudimentary drawings of the camp's layout. It was as if, even imprisoned, even tortured, she knew she was writing something bigger than herself. Reading that diary was like burying my head in an abyss. I felt drowning in mud. Because there were the details that books ignored. There was the raw reality of a war that refused to end, even when the treaties had already been signed. The camp where Marta was held was officially a humanitarian triage center. But its pages revealed another truth. It was a place of punishment, of revenge, of despair. And the scariest thing of all was that, in the midst of it all, my own blood might be involved. Jadwiga told me that she had hidden the diary when the camp was decommissioned. Marta didn't survive. She was executed, or disappeared, no one knew for sure. But before she was taken away, she handed the notebook to the nurse, begging that if the world ever wanted to hear, she should show it. And for some reason, she thought I was that person. "You have his eyes," she said, referring to the man who visited the camp in a grey overcoat. "But your eyes carry questions. His carried decisions." I left that house with the diary clutched to my chest, my heart racing, and my mind filled with a guilt that wasn't even mine, but now was too. Marta's diary became more than a document. It became a mirror. A whisper from the past that said, "Don't forget us." And I didn't forget. I could never forget again. Because when you hold in your hands the story of someone who was erased, not by bombs, but by silence, you understand that there are wars that continue even after the shooting stops. Wars of memory, of truth, of humanity. And as long as diaries like Marta's remain hidden in basements, waiting for someone brave enough to read them, the world will remain divided between those who remember and those who choose to forget. I chose to remember, even if it costs me peace. Even if it shows me that the worst part of the post-war period wasn't the rubble, but the lives that were never rebuilt. After I left Jadwiga's house with Marta's diary under my arm, something inside me broke completely. It was no longer an investigation. It was no longer curiosity. It was mourning. A mourning for someone I never knew, but who was now part of me like a shadow that refused to go away. I read and reread those pages late into the night, like someone trying to understand a dead language. Every sentence Marta said seemed to have been written with blood, sweat, and fear. And most disturbing of all was the way she accepted her own death. As if she already knew her story wouldn't have a happy ending. As if the only thing that mattered was leaving something behind, even if the world chose not to look. I returned to the camp. Or what was left of it. The structures had been demolished in the 1950s. In their place was dense undergrowth, overgrown trees, and a few stone foundations barely visible beneath the dry leaves. But I knew it was there. I had Marta's maps. The descriptions. The main gate was to the east, facing the railroad. The barracks, lined up in an L shape. The basement, hidden beneath what she called the House of Dead Eyes, a small building where interrogations took place. When I reached this point, my entire body shivered. The air was heavy, almost still. And even surrounded by nature, I felt as if I was stepping into a cemetery with no headstones. I stood there for hours, in silence, trying to hear the echo of the past among the trees. And that's when I decided I needed to dig deeper. I needed to confirm what my heart already suspected. That the silent man, described by Marta, was indeed my grandfather. Not because I wanted to point a finger, but because I needed to know who he was. I needed to understand if the man who gave me candy when I was a child was the same one who condemned young men to death with a nod. And if so, then I needed to face it. As a grandson. As a man. As someone who carries in his veins the shadow of a generation that chose to remain silent. I began tracking down military documents. I requested access to French archives, even though I knew many of the reports from the time had been destroyed or lost. But some names were still there. Lists of administrators. Service orders. In one of them, dated September 1946, I found Franz K., supervisor of logistics and intern triage. My heart raced. The name, the position, the date, everything fit. In another, more vague report, there was a description of a Franz responsible for reviewing interrogation protocols. Nothing explicit. Nothing direct. But enough for me to know. He was there. He saw. At home, I sat in front of the box of mementos I still kept of him. Medals, old letters, a photograph of him standing in front of a building I now recognized, the camp building. In the image, he stands with his arms crossed, wearing his grey coat. His eyes are exactly as Marta described. Cold. Expressionless. And in the background, almost out of focus, is a line of people. Civilians. Men. Women. Children. Staring at the camera as if they knew this image would be their last. And my grandfather is there. In the center. Motionless. As if he had already accepted the role the world had given him. That photo destroyed me. 4 days, I couldn't eat. I couldn't sleep. All I saw were his eyes. And Marta's eyes. And her words describing the man who never spoke, but decided everything. I wanted to believe he was just following orders. That he tried to help. That he hated it all. But the truth is, I don't know. I'll never know. Because he never spoke. Because he chose to die with the secret. And perhaps that's why he was a prisoner of his own silence until the end of his life. The same silence that now infiltrated me, like a cursed inheritance. I began to have nightmares. I dreamed of Marta walking through the fields, her hands dirty with dirt, looking at me without saying anything. Other times, I dreamed of my grandfather, sitting on the porch, offering me a sweet, while behind him faceless figures appeared, pointing, accusing. And I was in the middle. Lost. Torn between two times, two realities, two worlds that couldn't coexist. And it was in this abyss that I understood. War doesn't end when the shooting stops. It continues within us. In our gestures. In our silences. In the eyes of those who pretend they didn't see it. There was a moment when I thought about stopping. When I wanted to burn the diary, forget everything, bury the memory like they did with so many bodies. But then I remembered Marta's words, if I disappear, may these words not disappear with me. And so, I kept going. Even though it hurt. Even though I was bleeding inside. Because telling her story was the only way to make sense of mine. To look in the mirror and know that, even carrying the blood of a man who may have been an accomplice, I chose a different path. The path of truth. But truth doesn't come without a price. It demands it. It demands that you face your ghosts. That you accept that the people you loved may have committed horrors. That you understand that sometimes evil isn't in monsters, but in ordinary people, in those who obey, in those who remain silent. And silence, I learned, is the soil where injustice thrives most strongly. My grandfather lived in this silence. He died with it. And now I fight against it. Because if Marta's story survives, if every word of her diary is heard, then perhaps, finally, the silence will begin to crumble. And it was there, facing the ruins of the field, with the wind. Cutting my face and my eyes filled with tears, I promised, I will tell everything. Even if no one wants to hear it. Even if they hate me for it. Because this story is no longer just yours, Marta. It's mine too. And I swear, it will not be forgotten. After the promise I made before the ruins of that camp, something shifted inside me. It wasn't a smooth shift. It was as if I had crossed an invisible line, a point of no return. From that moment on, my quest was no longer just for historical justice, it was for personal redemption. I began carrying Marta's diary with me everywhere, as if it were a reliquary. Her words echoed in my mind like a profane prayer, a confession of pain that could no longer be ignored. Each sentence of hers took root deeper, as if it were being written within me, by my own hand. And the more I read, the more I realized there was something even darker hidden in that story, something that wasn't in the archives or the testimonies, but between the lines, in the silences between the words. It was during a freezing dawn, alone in a cheap hotel on the German-Polish border, that I began to cross-reference names, dates, and maps. One part of Marta's diary spoke of a mass transfer, a convoy that left the camp in December 1946 with over 200 people. Men, women, children. The destination? A place called Station 13. That expression disturbed me. Station 13 didn't appear in any official records, not even on the railway maps of the time. It was like a code. Something purposefully hidden. Hidden behind a banal word. But Marta said it clearly, Station 13 is the end. Whoever goes there, doesn't come back. I spent days trying to track down that name. Nothing. It was as if it had been erased from history. Until, by chance, I came across a reference in a declassified Soviet report that mentioned transfers completed in the forest zone north of Severydayvoice, a spa town that, ironically, had served as a sanatorium before the war. This forest zone also didn't appear in recent records. But by overlaying old maps with satellite imagery, I identified a forgotten trail that led to a clearing, isolated, far from any civilization. That place pulsed with an unnatural kind of silence. A heavy silence. As if the earth there knew too much. When I got there, the weather was strange. Cloudy, windless, the kind of weather that seems suspended, as if the world were waiting for something. I walked the trail for over an hour until I reached the clearing. Nothing remained there but disturbed earth, as if something had been buried, or unearthed, not long ago. But there were marks. Marks that only those who know the scent of history recognize. Stone circles. Burnt trunks. A piece of rusty iron with what looked like part of a lock. And then I found a broken board with 3 letters carved with a knife, S13. I didn't need anything else. It was real. Station 13 existed. And whatever happened there was done with the care of someone who wanted to erase everything later. But forgetting is impossible. Right there, kneeling on that wet earth, I felt a tightness in my chest that stole my breath. I began to hear Marta's breathing in the darkness of my mind. As if she were there, beside me. As if whispering, "You've arrived." And with that, a horrible feeling took hold of me. The certainty that maybe, just maybe, my grandfather not only knew about Station 13, but had authorized that convoy. Or participated. Or watched. Or, who knows, simply allowed it. Doubt tore at me inside. I wanted to scream, but there was no one else there. Just me, the invisible bones beneath the ground, and a past that stubbornly refused to die. I returned to the hotel like a walking corpse. I spent days in silence. Refusing food. Refusing words. The only thing keeping me going was the diary. Marta's words, which were no longer just hers. They were mine. As if, by reading them, I had become the new guardian of a truth no one wanted. And it was in this state, between fever, delirium, and exhaustion, that I had a vision that marked me forever. I dreamed of Marta in a train car. She was looking out the window, her face calm, almost serene. But in the background, a figure appeared in the corridor. It was my grandfather. Young. In uniform. With a notebook in his hand. They stared at each other. He hesitated. She smiled. And then he disappeared. I woke in tears. Not because the dream was frightening, but because, for the first time, I felt compassion for him. War transforms us. But what comes after can be even crueler. Because there is no heroism in silence. There is no honor in omission. And perhaps my grandfather was just one of thousands of ordinary men thrown into a scenario where no choice was pure. Where right and wrong blended into grey. Where survival often meant accepting, or executing, orders that violated everything human. This doesn't exonerate him. But it humanizes him. And understanding this was the most difficult step of this journey. Station 13, I later discovered, was mentioned in other diaries. In letters never delivered. In scribbles made by prisoners on the walls of old train stations. It was a kind of real myth, a name whispered in fear, known to many but recorded by few. Officially, it never existed. Unofficially, it was a place of silent execution. A point of extermination without gas chambers, without ovens, without symbols. Just abandonment. An end without ritual. Oblivion as a sentence. And this, in a way, is even more terrible than the documented horrors of war. Because here, no one was even told. Today, when I talk about all this, people ask me, but why do you insist? Why revive these shadows? And the answer is simple, because someone needs to. Because as long as voices like Marta's are silenced, as long as places like Station 13 remain buried under layers of oblivion, we will all be trapped in a cycle of lies. Of denial. Of repetition. And because perhaps the greatest act of courage is to remember. Even when it hurts. Even when everything inside you asks you to forget. Memory is a weapon. And I chose to wield it. Not to condemn. But to illuminate. So that names like Marta's, and so many others that she never managed to write, do not disappear into the abyss that opened after the war. An abyss where justice was lost, where the guilty were acquitted and the innocent erased. And now, it is up to me, and perhaps you, to decide if we will continue to ignore this void. Or if we will finally have the courage to face it. Wort by wort. Bone by bone. truth by truth, until silence can no longer protect us. As my research progressed, a disturbing truth began to emerge. The post-war period brought not only reconstruction, but also a new kind of violence, hidden behind the veil of international justice. It didn't take long for me to realize that the victors of World War II wanted not only to punish the Nazis, but also to control who would have a place in the New World Order. And in the midst of all this were people like my grandfather, men and women who carried secrets, moral dilemmas, and, above all, a responsibility that no one wanted to admit. I could no longer separate the man from the story, the family member from the accused. Every time I looked at old photos, where my grandfather appears smiling at family gatherings, I saw his eyes filled with silence. A silence that I now understood to be a stifled cry, an unconfessed guilt. It was as if he had lived carrying an invisible weight, a burden that not even decades of peace had been able to alleviate. Amidst these discoveries, one episode left a deep impression on me. In a forgotten letter addressed to a distant friend, my grandfather wrote, "The war is over, but the shadows still walk beside us. And it's not the bombs that kill the most. It's what's unsaid, what's unseen." Those words tore me apart, because I could feel, in that short sentence, the anguish of a man caught between duty and humanity. And there began my darkest reflection: how to judge someone who was trapped in the moral labyrinth of the post-war period. How to separate guilt from survival. Was my grandfather a misunderstood hero, a coward, or something in between? I have no easy answers. And perhaps that is the greatest injustice of all, the inability to understand that the post-war period was not black and white, but a tangle of ashes, where victims and executioners often switched roles. Justice, from what I discovered, was not meted out uniformly. There were secret deals, pardons offered in exchange for information, and a dangerous game between the emerging powers of the Cold War. And while Nazi officials were tried in public courts, many of those who committed equally heinous crimes were used as strategic pawns. Scientists, spies, torturers, some were recruited by the Americans, others by the Soviets. It was a macabre exchange, a kind of silent pact to ensure the past wouldn't catch up with them. The weight of this reality fell upon me when I found secret documents mentioning operations to rehabilitate former Nazis for strategic roles within the new European institutions. It was as if the world had closed its eyes in order to move forward, accepting that justice was something relative, shaped by the interests of the moment. And I, who had always seen my grandfather as a respectable figure, began to understand that he was part of this complex system, where the line between the law and impunity was tenuous and often invisible. But, contrary to what many think, this process wasn't just about complicity. There were also victims, civilians, prisoners, ordinary people who suffered consequences for being on the wrong side. Women abused in displacement camps, families driven from their homes, people disappeared without a trace. These stories were buried, silenced so that the official narrative could thrive. And upon discovering this, I felt a deep revolt, an urgent need to give voice to those who never had one. That's why I decided not to limit myself to telling the cold, dry facts from the archives. I decided to delve into the emotions, the humanity of the people involved. Because, in the end, the post-war period wasn't just politics and geopolitics. It was suffering, it was silence, it was choice. And the choices made back then shaped the world we live in today. My grandfather, like many others, lived in this moral limbo. Perhaps he tried to do what he thought was right, or perhaps he surrendered to the system to survive. I will never know. But I know that true justice isn't just a courtroom, nor a sentence. It's acknowledging the stories, no matter how uncomfortable they may be. It's about facing the naked truth, even when it confronts us with our own ghosts. Now, more than ever, I feel my mission is to bring these forgotten stories to light. Because the past only ceases to be a burden when it is faced with courage. And even if the injustices of the post-World War II era seem distant, they echo to this day, in our memories, in our choices, and in our responsibility not to repeat the same mistakes. And that's why I invite you not only to watch, but to reflect with me. To not close your eyes to the shadows that still walk alongside us. Because only then, together, can we begin to build true justice, a justice that does not forget the forgotten. The silence of the past is not empty. It is filled with voices that were unheard, with stories that were buried under the weight of a tacit agreement between the victors and the forgotten. It was at this point in my journey that I began to realize the true extent of post-World War II injustice, not only because of the crimes committed, but because of the way the world chose to forget, hide, and even erase entire fragments of memory. And I saw myself as someone destined to break this silence, even if it meant opening wounds that many would prefer to keep closed. Looking back, I see that my search wasn't just for historical truth. It was a desperate attempt to understand my own identity, to reconcile the love I felt for the man who was my grandfather with the horrors he may have witnessed, or even allowed. As if his shadow projected an echo within me, an echo that demanded a response, that called me to face what many avoid. And each discovery, each page of Marta's diary, each old photograph, was a mirror where I saw not only the past, but my deepest reflection, my own humanity confronted. I won't lie, it was a lonely and painful journey. I often felt like a spectre walking among ruins, trying to piece together a story that time insisted on shattering. Friends asked me why I insisted on reliving such a dark past. The answer was simple, but difficult to explain, because ignoring the past doesn't make it disappear. On the contrary, it grows within us, fueling fears, prejudices, and a sense of disconnection that makes it impossible to truly move forward. On a particularly cold night, sitting in the darkness of my room, writing the last lines of Marta's diary, I realized that the injustice I sought to uncover was not an isolated event. It was an open wound that spanned generations, shaping the present in subtle and profound ways. The post-war period, with all its promises of reconstruction and peace, was also the beginning of a cycle of exclusion and silence for those considered the others. The expelled Germans, the displaced, those forgotten by official history. I remembered an account I found in an old document, where a woman described how, after the war, her family was driven from their home, and justly accused of crimes they never committed. She spoke of loss, despair, exile within one's own continent, of a feeling of abandonment that seemed to pierce the very heart of Europe. That voice, so human, so close, made me understand that post-war injustice wasn't just about numbers, statistics, or policies. It was about lives, about shattered dreams and stolen futures. And what frightens me most, perhaps, is realizing that this same logic of exclusion is still present today. How often, in the name of justice, are entire communities punished? How often do we look at the suffering of others and decide it's less important because it happened on the wrong side? This reflection made me question not only the past, but the present, and realize that the greatest challenge is not just remembering, but learning to look with empathy at those who suffered, even when her story is uncomfortable, complex, and nuanced. That's why, even when the pain tightened my chest and the feeling of helplessness overwhelmed me, I knew I couldn't give up. Because giving up would mean betraying Marta's memory, the memory of so many other voices crying out to be heard. And it would mean allowing silence to win again. So I held the journal tightly, took a deep breath, and continued. I continued because I believe that the past, however dark, must be faced with courage so that we can build a different future. Today, looking back, I feel that this journey has transformed me, not only as a researcher, but as a human being. I understood that true justice isn't something achieved only in courtrooms, but that it is built every day, in the choices we make to acknowledge the pain of others, to give voice to the silenced, to avoid repeating the mistakes of the past. And that memory, even when heavy, is a flame that can light the way, if we have the courage to keep it burning. So, if you're watching this account, I extend an invitation. Don't shy away from history out of fear or discomfort. Face it. Question it. Listen to the voices that have been silenced. Because only then can we break the cycle of injustice that permeates not only the post-war period, but our own time. And perhaps, together, we can find a way to honor the victims the world has tried to forget. And that, for me, is true justice. The justice that arises from memory, empathy, and the courage to look to the past, not to condemn, but to learn, to transform, and to never again allow injustice to disguise itself as silence. In the stillness of a cold night, I realized that the true dimension of post-World War II injustices lay not only in the facts I uncovered, but in the constant feeling of absence, the void left by voices that were never heard, by stories that were erased, and by lives lost in the silence imposed by time and official history. This absence, this invisible shadow, was more painful than any document I could find. It was then that I understood that the greatest challenge was not only to bring these forgotten narratives to light, but to accept that they are part of our present, of our world. They live in gazes that avoid contact, in families marked by secrets, in cities that bear scars that official memory tries to hide. And, above all, in myself, in my struggle to understand and reconcile the man who was my grandfather with the monster and the victim that history dares not define. This discovery didn't bring me easy answers, nor comfort. It brought doubts, anguish, an almost suffocating feeling of responsibility. Because I realized that carrying this memory is also carrying the obligation to speak, to question, to remember, even when the truth is too bitter to swallow. And, ultimately, it is in this courage to face the past, with all its imperfections and shadows, that lies the hope for a future where justice is not just a distant concept, but a living and present practice. I clearly remember that afternoon when I received an anonymous letter that would change the course of my search and deepen even more the shadow of injustice that I already carried. The letter was inside a simple envelope, with no return address, and contained a single page with a short but heavy message: "The silence you seek is in Berlin. Look for the archive of shadows." I didn't know what to expect, but I knew I couldn't ignore it. It was an invitation, or perhaps a challenge, to look deeper, where few had the courage to go. I left for Berlin a few days later, carrying with me Marta's diary, the old photographs, the documents, and that anguish that seemed to never leave me. The Archive of Shadows, as it was informally called, was a secret collection of documents kept hidden from the public, a kind of repository of uncomfortable truths, of stories that didn't fit into the official justice script. Reaching it wasn't easy. I had to get around bureaucracy, deal with reluctant officials, and face closed doors. But persistence prevailed, and in a cold room filled with folders yellowed with age, I found records that made my heart stop. Among those papers were internal reports, transfer lists, crossed-out names, handwritten notes, some stained with blood or tears. Documents that revealed that my grandfather, far from being a mere spectator, was involved in decisions that condemned thousands to silent fates, forgotten by history. He wasn't just a logistics or triage supervisor. He wielded power, and he used that power to ensure that certain prisoners never left that limbo between life and death. It was painful to face that reality. Every word in the documents was a blow to the chest. But the worst part was to find proof that many of those sent to places like Station 13 or other hidden centers were not criminals, but innocent victims, refugees, entire families, women and children who became pawns in a dirty game of revenge and politics. And my grandfather was there, signing papers, approving lists, closing doors that would never be opened to them again. This discovery broke me. I wanted to run away, hide the diary, forget the letter, bury the documents, and erase everything. But I couldn't. Because, when I looked at the yellow pages, I saw Marta's face, her eyes pleading for justice. I saw every name erased, every life stolen, and I knew I couldn't remain silent. I was the only one capable of telling this story. And it was a responsibility I couldn't abdicate. In that dark room, surrounded by shadows from the past, I made the decision that would change everything. I would no longer be a simple narrator, a cold investigator. I would be a bearer of memory, a messenger of buried truths. Because justice, I understood there, is not just punishment. It's remembering. It's acknowledging pain, error, human failure. It's giving voice to those silenced by fear, politics, and time. I returned home with the documents in hand, but carrying a heavier weight in my heart. I knew this story wouldn't be accepted by everyone. That many would try to silence me, discredit me, hide me. But I was prepared. Because if I've learned anything on this journey, it's that the truth, no matter how painful, is the only light capable of piercing the darkness of injustice. Today, when I close my eyes, I still hear the whisper of Marta's diary pages. I hear the voices of those who have been forgotten. And I know that as long as those voices exist, as long as I breathe, I cannot give up. Because true justice isn't just about trials or sentences. It's about not letting silence win. It's about keeping memory alive. It's about transforming the pain of the past into a commitment to the future. And that, my friends, is the story I came to tell. A story of shadows, of secrets, of injustices that still echo. But also a story of courage, the courage to face the truth, even when it's too dark to bear. Because only by facing the past can we build a different tomorrow. A tomorrow where justice is, in fact, justice for all. Today, as I conclude this journey, I feel the weight of all the stories I've carried with me, the silenced voices, the injustices that have never been redressed. I know my search doesn't bring easy answers, nor redemption. But it has brought awareness. And maybe, just maybe, this awareness is the first step toward a different future. If I can leave you with anything, it's an invitation to not forget these shadows of the past. Because silence perpetuates pain, and only by remembering can we prevent history from repeating itself. If you want to continue exploring these hidden truths with me, subscribe to the channel and leave a comment. Together, we can keep alive the memory of those the world tried to erase.